This is lecture 7 of the course Haridas Chaudhuri and Integral Yoga, and the first lecture for the book Being, Evolution and Immortality, an Outline of Integral Philosophy. In this lecture, we'll be covering the first 5 chapters of this book. Haridas Chaudhuri in these 5 chapters introduces the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo as integral Vedanta, integral non-dualism, or integralism. These are 3 synonymous terms. He first uses the term integral Vedanta to contextualize the yoga of Sri Aurobindo or the integral philosophy of Sri Aurobindo within the traditions of Indian philosophy, particularly those philosophies related to the interpretations of the Upanishads known as Vedanta. So he first starts by calling it an integral Vedanta, and then he widens the scope because Vedanta is about non-dualism. He gives it a wider, more international scope by calling it integral non-dualism philosophically. And finally, he just calls it integralism. That's his term for the integral philosophy of Sri Aurobindo. And Chaudhuri tries to define what he means by integral philosophy in a couple of short sentences, so we get an expectation of what he is aiming at. For one, he calls it the art of harmonious and creative living. And the other sentence he has for it is, it harmonizes all fragmentary experiences in a comprehensive truth vision. So these are some approaches to the idea of integral philosophy, and Haridas Chaudhuri is going to explicate or expand on the philosophical foundations of what he calls integral philosophy as a art of harmonious and creative living, and something which harmonizes all fragmentary experiences in a comprehensive truth vision. So before looking at these definitions and at the philosophies that Chaudhuri considers, it is also useful to talk about the source of the integral as Haridas Chaudhuri sees it in these chapters. And he does that by going to the Upanishads. So this is where, in a sense, he is pointing to the source of integral Vedanta as a verse from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the earliest Upanishads, and showing that to be the source of the integral, the idea of the integral that we find philosophically expanded by Sri Aurobindo. This verse is very well known. It is known as the Purnam mantra. It also occurs at the beginning as a kind of a headpiece for the Isha Upanishad. It goes Purna Ada Purna Idam Purnasya Purnam Udachyate Purnasya Purnam Adaya Purnam Eva Vashishyate. And Chaudhuri is going to translate this as this is the full, or we may call it the whole. This is the whole, that is the whole. From the whole emerges. If we subtract the whole from the whole, it is the whole that remains. So this is a paradoxical description of something which is radically infinite and absolutely one. So a radical infinity and an absolute unity at once. We can see how that is the case, and we can also see how this description relates to an understanding of the relation between the absolute and the cosmic, or the supracosmic and the cosmic and the individual. So if we say that there is something which is unconditional, and something that cannot be determined, indeterminate, absolutely infinite. Out of that, some kind of a whole can emerge. This is what we call cosmos. So when we are talking about cosmos, it's a determinate field, a field of determinations. And this field, if it has emerged out of something which is entirely free, must have that as its source. So we can think of something from which the cosmos has emerged. Where has it emerged from? Something which is whole. And by whole is meant something which has infinite potential, radically infinite potential, and is one at the same time. It's an absolute unity and a radical infinity. Now, within this cosmos, what we are being told is that the emergence of the cosmos has taken place out of the radical infinity of the whole, but it is also itself a whole. In other words, the radical infinity of the whole resides in the another order of infinity, a lesser order of infinity that we may call cosmos. Again, within cosmos, we have other entities that are parts of the cosmos, that belong to the cosmos, including classes of individuals and ultimately individuals or entities themselves. Now, each of these entities can be considered an emergence out of the cosmos, and it can also be considered as something which is moving out of the cosmos, is existing, is coming out and having a reality of its own. But the verse is telling us that whatever is emerging is also nothing but the whole. These finite emergences are ultimately radically infinite. There's something radically infinite that has taken on the appearance of the finite. And in doing so, that from which it emerged is not reduced at all. It remains infinite and radically infinite. So this is a state of understanding and experience, and also a state of being, an ontology, to which we are being invited. And to experience things like that is to experience the integral. This is, in a way, the scope, overall, overarching scope of the integral. But to get to this experience is not easy, because we lead a fragmented experience. And that is what the whole notion of harmonizing all fragmentary experiences in a comprehensive truth vision implies. We have to first be aware of the fragmentation. No question of integration can emerge until we accept the fragmentation of reality. And that fragmentation of reality is also a experience or a perception, because in a way we take it for granted, and in a way we hide from it. So what is fragmentation? It helps for us to dwell on that a little bit. We've already considered that to some extent in the previous lectures and the previous texts. So we can see a variety of ways in which we encounter fragmentation. First and most obvious is an ontological fragmentation, which we have considered earlier, where everything is separate. There is a separateness of finite entities. We ourselves have finite existences in space and time. We occupy a finite space with our bodies, and we occupy a finite a period, duration in time, bounded by a birth and a death. So this is the story of every entity. It is finite, it occupies a finite space and time. And in that, it is located and these locations are separate for every entity and individual. So we experience reality as a multiplicity of such entities bounded in space and time with whom we share that space and that time. So that is our first sense of fragmentation, which is an ontological fragmentation. This is what is given to us as being, as the nature of being that we experience. Then we can talk about differences in kind as a sort of fragmentation. We look around us and we see that we can overcome this sense of fragmentation, at least to some extent, by seeing others like us. This is where the whole notion of identity comes in. Identity begins in the individual, but is extended to a group, family, nation, all of humanity, perhaps. And each of these is a kind of, encapsulation, and sometimes an overlapping encapsulation of what we may call one's own identity. So outside that is something which is different, fragmented. So we've now created larger fragments of classes of entities. These classes of entities are different in kind. So it's like we say we cannot compare apples and oranges. By that is meant that the world is made up of heterogeneous categories of entities that are fragmented as differences in kind. Then we have what are called emergent properties. In time, we see that new properties emerge. Life emerges in dead matter. Thinking entities emerge in living matter. And these properties are separate from each other. We may say that they are overlapping, and we'll consider that in a moment. But at some point, at some level, there are differences in kind. They seem to be fragmented from each other at some point. Then these classes of fragmentation are in a way given to us. But then we also create our own classes of fragmentation. For example, we try to make sense of the world, and we find that we arrive at interpretations. And these interpretations are different. They are not all the same. So these interpretations are narrower or wider. Sometimes interpretations are cosmic and give an explanation for the entire universe and the place of the human in it. These become ideologies. And these differences in interpretations and ideologies constitutes another source of fragmentation. We are constantly at war with one another and otherizing other humans based on the fact that we don't have the same interpretations of the cosmos. Finally, even in terms of our life together, there is fragmentation in classifications. And this is a particularly modern notion. Earlier, we didn't have this to that extent because it's in modernity that we find a rational attempt to organize human collective life. We don't organize our collective lives by ourselves through participation, but we organize very large masses of people that constitute entities like nations or continents. We also organize non-humans based on our need from the world. And we do this by creating categories and by establishing these categories in terms of some taxonomies. These classification systems also create separations and fragmentations. They are exclusive of one another, don't seem to have middle ground, And we often find that if we look at different classification systems, what I am classified by in one system does not necessarily map to the same classification in another system. So we find that these are overlaps that are not acknowledged in the classification systems developed for organizing human life, particularly in our times, because these are rational organizations. Then there are epistemological and technological forms of fragmentation. And by that I mean that to understand reality, we specialize. We give the task of a fragmented little piece of reality to specialize in for our academic understanding so that we can piece together the world. This world is a piecing together of fragments of knowledge forming what one might call a whole. Even our works in the world, which we think of as technological, are often specialized forms of technology that are assembled together to form larger bodies of knowledge. These are all forms of fragmentation. Some of them are man-made forms of fragmentation that have arisen from the operations of the reason. Because the reason creates these categories that are separate, that are excluded from one another and have no middle ground between them. But some of them are not human-made, some of them are given to us by nature itself. And there too we find that there are degrees of separation, but at some point there is a hard line differentiating kinds of entities, individual entities, as well as of properties that emerge in time. Now, all these fragmentations are kept in place by some kind of ontology, which we may call an ontology of mind. This is not necessarily the individual mind or even the collective mind of humans, but a kind of cosmic mind that has created a world of fragmentation for its own purpose. That purpose ultimately can be thought of as relationality. So the absolute has been relativized. We live in a world in which there are relative standpoints that are in relation with one another. The ontology that they create is a relational ontology. Now, from here we come to a thinking about harmony, because this is the problem of the fragmentation. Fragmentation is something that can plunge us into a chaos if we do not know how to put that fragmentation together to form some kind of unity. Or else, if we form these partial unities in the name of the whole, then we come to another and even worse problem, which is the problem of mistaking a larger part for the whole. And this is, politically speaking, the foundation of fascism, where we try to build a whole, but with the same mental faculty that fragments, we put together a very large fragment, and then we wish away the rest. We exile it from our minds, or we try to exterminate it, or we try to force it into our category. So these are the ways by which the mind tries to deal with fragmentation and the difficulties that it creates. However, there are other ways of thinking about the overcoming of fragmentation. So we find that we have various, standpoints, and some of these standpoints are contradictory to other standpoints. And so if instead of taking each one of them and considering it to be absolute, if we look at each of these different standpoints by themselves, we can start finding significance in them. They have significance to us, which is not necessarily significance that is exclusive. See, so for example, if we think about a transcendental ideology, an ideology that thinks about the world as something that is like a prison and we need to escape from it, we need to be free of it. This freedom of transcendence gives us a certain value or significance. Its significance is in knowing that there is something outside of whatever can be determined. But at the same time, by looking exclusively at that, we lose the world, any significance to life in the world, to the will in the world, or to relationship in the world. And so when we consider those things, we find that they are significant in their own way. So we have to think about these contradictions where one gets erased by the other as having equal significance, though it belongs to another class. It's again a heterogeneity, but having significance which is a significance of multiplicity. Again, we find this with problem with the universal and the particular. Chaudhuri gives an example from the Chandogya Upanishad where they are trying to reduce all things to the Brahman. And the example given is that of gold and its various manifestations. So the same gold is turned into a variety of objects. They are objects that we take for functional use, but if we melt them, we get the same thing called gold. So in a way, they're talking about a substantial unity of all individual products. Just as we started with the Sanskrit hymn known as Purnam, where we are saying that the same thing, the fullness of Brahman has become all the existences of the world and is present in all of them. If we are to reduce those individuals, we'll come back to the wholeness from which they emerged. But what Chaudhuri is pointing out is that, wait a minute, let's also look at the objects that were produced in trying to get back to the substance from which all these objects were produced. What about the significance of those objects? Gold was made into ornaments, and those ornaments were artifacts, objects of art and beauty that had a tremendous amount of significance in and by themselves as objects. And so this is the significance of the particular as against the significance of the universal. We have to give value to each of them. We cannot reduce one to the other. Similarly, he considers being and becoming. On the one hand, there is eternity, something outside of time, since we are beings that are harried by time and that are devoured by time. We emerge in time and we disappear. We are destroyed by time. The question is that can we find something that is outside of time? This becomes one of the attempts to escape from the imprisonment of time existence. But Chaudhuri is saying that that may have its own significance, the significance of freedom. But what about the fact that in time, novelty emerges? Something new is constantly emerging in time, and that has its own value and significance, evolutionary emergences. So, taking stock of multiple forms of significance in terms of even contradictions gives us a approach to include, comprehend. You see, he uses the term comprehensive. So comprehend and bring together, make one, a variety of understandings and realities. So now let's go back and to look again at those sentences. It harmonizes all fragmentary experiences in a comprehensive truth vision. So we just saw how we can try to include even opposites in a wider comprehension. Let's think about harmony for a bit. Harmony acknowledges also differences, and harmony is trying to see how these differences can relate to each other in a ordered or a way that is a value of unity, that there's some unity that arises out of the relationship without destroying their plural character, even whether they're plural, entity, value, or their plural qualities. So we can think about various forms of harmony that differences can be put into. The most obvious is uniformity. In other words, we bring everything down to the same category. We make them into differences of degree. In other words, just like we were talking about gold and the ornaments, if we make everything into just the substance gold and we put them together, then we have a kind of harmony. Actually, we don't, because harmony implies difference. And here we can have maybe differences of a certain type, differences in weight or differences in volume. But what we don't have is differences in substance. So we have found a certain kind of, basis or datum of uniformity from which we can say that all these things are the same, so they are in harmony with one another. But this kind of harmony is a reduction. It is again just like we were talking about the fact that all the other significances are taken out by this. So can we think about a harmony that retains multiplicity of significances? One other kind of harmony can be symmetry. So in symmetry, we can have again a kind of difference in degree in the fact that we can compare qualities that are put in a certain order in which there is a kind of a harmony of order in which the different entities that are put together are balanced. They are balanced in a symmetric form. So here again we have a common datum from which we can measure the fact that there is a balance taking place. Now, this may not be the case. As we said, we live in a heterogeneous world in which there are differences in kind. So another way of thinking about it is of harmony is in terms of complementarity. So there we see that when we talked about significance, we can see that there are different entities that have different kinds of significance, and these things of different significance can coexist and be complements of each. They can complement each other. They even seem to be opposites, but they complement each other. Each one comes into use at certain times or in a certain form, in a certain order, etc. So this can also be with regard to function. And this is how we find, for example, wholes, whether we think of an individual as a whole or we think of even a machine as a whole, whatever whole that we think of, the entire cosmos as a whole, we find that it's made up of parts that are differences in kind, but they work together. They've created a system in which they are complements of each other. Now, there's a deeper degree of complementarity, particularly in objects of organic unity, and that is immanence. And so by immanence, again, we can talk about degrees of immanence. On the one hand, we can say that if there are differences in kind, different types of entities that make up a single organic whole, they're parts of an organic whole, they serve a complementary function to the functioning of the whole, but they are more, to some extent, they say substitute for each other. There are overlaps in their functions. One takes over when another cannot do what it is supposed to do. So there seem to be some kind of immanence of each in the other. Now that in medieval philosophy, that was thought of as folding. Everything, we lived in a folded universe. Everything is folded into everything else. And there were two terms used, perplication and complication. So perplication means it's like a kind of a braiding, like a threading of different things forming a single strand. So we can say that if there are heterogeneous objects or heterogeneous entities, qualities forming a whole, then each of them invisibly or in a subtle form has the others braided into it. And so that if it's necessary, then there is a certain kind of communication that takes place between these entities, between these parts, as it were. Sri Aurobindo sees, in fact, the differences in the differences of kind, of qualities in the individual of this kind of perplicated and complicated. Now, complication, it doesn't mean something, as it normally means in everyday speech, but what complication means in a technical and philosophical way, the word pli is to fold. Pli is to fold. So complication is folded together. So in other words, just like perplication is folded with each other, so it's like a kind of a braiding, complication is a collecting. So all these various strands are collected. They belong to the whole. They live together in the whole. So these two types of each braiding the other into itself and each living with the other in the whole form a certain internal system of harmony that gives a meaning to the whole that is belies the separateness and fragmentation that the mind sees it through. So this is one way of understanding harmony. And then, but this way of understanding harmony is also something that is related to parts that form a whole. It's a whole with parts in it. And the final kind of harmony is what we've been discussing as the integral, the first definition of the integral, which is the supramental convergent coexistence of plural absolutes. And by that I mean that all these entities, all these qualities, all these wholes, all these ideologies, each one is a absolute. That's because of as we discussed with the Purna mantra, the mantra of the whole, each one is the whole. The whole has become each one. And at the same time, they are operating together. So there is a way in which they converge into the whole, and yet they exist with each other without erasing or getting erased by the whole or erasing each other in the whole. A convergent coexistence of plural absolutes. That is a ontology that exceeds the fragmentation of the mind and is almost a new plane of existence. that is beyond the mind. That's why it's called the supramental. Now, what Chaudhuri is going to say is that when we talk about the philosophy of integralism, if we actually just talk about the last, which is the supramental convergent coexistence of plural absolutes, then in a way we are fending off to the distant future, or maybe to a time, an impossible time, any other possibility of integrality. So when the philosophy of integralism includes all these forms of harmony that we spoke about, not uniformity, of course, and not a simplistic symmetry, but any kind of complementarity, any kind of immanence, realizing these forms of overcoming of the fragmentation in consciousness is a approach that prepares us eventually to experience the supramental harmony of the one in the many, and the many as the one. Now, with this, we enter into the chapters of for our consideration, and we find that Chaudhuri is going to frame it philosophically in terms of the three types of experiences that Sri Aurobindo had. And also, one may say, talk about it as three kinds of ontologies that are meshed with each other and form reality. The first is the transcendent, and we saw how that is related to the ontology of separateness in space and time. From that transcendent viewpoint, fragmentation is a mental operation of creating entities that are separate and experience reality from their own experience. Then there is the universal, where the cosmos has many parts to it, there are differences in kind, and a variety of ideological descriptions. And then finally, we have the individual. And in the case of the human, if we look at it from the viewpoint of fragmentation, the common one that is given to us by Descartes is that of the body and the mind. We are already split into a body and a mind. But if we go a little deeper, we'll find that there are other ways in which the mind as a conscious, kind of entity can be divided. And so we can look at the whole spectrum and say we have a physical existence, we have a volitional existence, an existence of will, we have an emotional existence, an existence of feeling, and we have a rational existence, the existence of the operation of the mind. These are complementary, as we saw. They are all operating together to form the function that is our human existence. But as we saw, they are sometimes seen in a hierarchic fashion, and we find that the mind tends to privilege itself over the others and dominate and or eradicate their significance. In Sri Aurobindo's view, here is again the case in the human where there is a perplication and a complication at work. In other words, each of these faculties in us has within it all the others. So mind and body are separate differences in kind, and also at the same time they have features of each other in them. In other words, that is, Sri Aurobindo will say that in the physical consciousness there is a physical, a physical vital, and a physical mental. In the vital or life consciousness, there is a vital physical, a vital, and a vital mental. And to the mind, there is a mechanical or physical mind, there is a vital mind, and there is a mental proper. Now, just for lack of time, we can consider one of these to see exactly what he's talking about. So, for example, if we think about the mind, we can study the mind and see that one part of the mind is extremely physical and mechanical. That's the part of habits that sometimes we can't even get over our habits. They run in autopilot. Sometimes we are repeating words all the time that we've heard, or songs, or nursery rhymes, or we are doing actions without thinking of them. It's the physical part of the mind that is controlling, and almost like a computer, the functions of the emotions, the body, etc. That is a large part of our normal existence. Then we have a vital mind or life mind, mind of desires, and a mind of will and energy that is coming up with novel ideas that it desires, and it is putting its energy behind it, trying to get the work done, planning, etc. And then we have a rational mind that can lend itself to the vital mind, but is different from it. It calculates, it understands things, classifies things, puts things into order. So that function is taking place. Kant would call these two the practical reason and the pure reason. So these are forms of the mind, and they involve the other parts of the being in their own translations. And as a result, they can interface with and resonate with differences in kind, the life energies and the physical energies. This is a kind of perplication. And the fact that they coexist in making up our psychological existence is a kind of complication. To experience them like this, to experience them in their freedom, is a different kind of experience than what we are usually used to, where one of these is predominating and dominating the others. Okay? So this would be a approach towards the integral. It would not be an integral consciousness, but that's the reason why in CIIS we say that we ought to open up different forms of knowing. The body has its own knowing, the emotion has its own knowing, the will has its own knowing, the mind has its own knowing. They're all necessary to us. But there's one more step to it, and that is, how do we integrate them? Can we find something in the human consciousness that actually is the one from which these are emanations? Just as in the Purnam, is there a whole which is the source from which these differentiations have taken place? And that for Sri Aurobindo is the psychic being. So we can keep that in mind. He does not address that directly. Chaudhuri does not address that directly in these 5 chapters. But if we are to talk about the fragmentation of the individual, we have to give value to those fragments and also look for that which integrates them. The integration of the intra-subjective is the psychic being. Now, Chaudhuri then goes on to talk about integral Vedanta, which is his first term in his introduction to integral philosophy. Integral Vedanta, as I said, Vedanta is an Indian Sanskrit term. It means end of the Veda, and these are the variety of interpretations of the Upanishads. They are each one different. There are many different interpretations of the Upanishads, usually 3 major kinds, and we'll get to that in a moment. But Chaudhuri begins by talking about Buddhism and comparing it to Vedanta to show again this notion of complementarity and Exactly, the notion of complementarity and equivalence, overlap and equivalence. Sometimes we give different names to the same thing or something very similar because we are looking at it from a different angle. But in experience, we find that it's much easier to integrate. So for Buddhism, we find that the goal of Buddhism is nirvana, which again, in different schools of Buddhism, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, has different definitions or different content. But overall, we may say it's a non-being. Why is it a non-being? It puts out the world of phenomena, the phenomenon of life, all the phenomena of life, the transience of life, that is put to an end, and what remains, the remainder, is transcendent of it, is a non-being from that. If we talk about our existence as being, what remains when existence is put out is a non-being. Now, we find that somebody by the name of Shankaracharya around the 8th century creates a interpretation of Vedanta or of the Upanishads that is known as Advaita Vedanta. Actually, it's known as Keval Advaita Vedanta, or exclusive non-dualism. And that is a similar type of putting out all the phenomena, the phenomenal experiences, and finding something extra cosmic and transcendental that remains, the remainder. The remainder in this case is a transcendental being. So Chaudhuri would say, in essence, from an experiential point of view, the talk of non-being in Buddhism and the talk of a extra cosmic transcendence in Advaita and Vedanta are the same experience. They are different ways of talking about and approaching the same extra cosmic transcendence that sees the phenomenal world as being and erases it. Now, to this, as I said earlier, this has value because it gives us freedom. It makes us see that there is something that we may experience as our identity that is free of all determination. But what good is that if we lose the world itself as a result? So other philosophies and interpretations of the Upanishads arise that see the world as real. And the three major types of interpretations are all interpretations that are theistic and consider Krishna to be Brahman, or the whole of reality, as in a form, in a paradoxical form, in an infinite form. So we find that with Vaishnavism we have three major interpretations. One is known as Vishisht Advaita, translated as qualified non-dualism. One is called Dvaita Advaita, or a kind of a monism in difference, a unity in difference. And the third is known as Dvaita, or a kind of dualism as the basis of a interpretation of the Upanishads. All these see Krishna as the whole, and that whole has got parts to it. So in the case of Vishisht Advaita, the world and all the beings in the world are the parts of this transcendental being, and controlled by that, they're dependent on and controlled by that transcendental being, and so they are operating, but their freedom lies in knowing their identity with the controller, and in that sense they find their true function in the world, which is one of the adoration of the whole, the adoration of Krishna. However, they believe that there is a ontological divide between Krishna's own reality, his own world, and the world in which we live, so that though we can have a degree of the experience of full freedom in closeness to Krishna. Freedom does not mean separation and exclusivity from Krishna, but intimate relation with Krishna. The full moksha of intimate relation is had after death in the world of Krishna, salokya, in the world of Krishna, and that is the culmination of this type of Vedanta. The other two types have different degrees of freedom for the individual. For example, in Dvaita, there are two different categories. The category of Krishna as the divine, and let's say human beings as parts of the divine are not really parts, they're separate from the divine. There's a separation, and yet they are dependent on the divine for their existence, and in a relationship of love with the divine that allows them to experience freedom, just as in the others. So in these kinds of interpretations of the Upanishads, there is value to relationality. There is value to the world. The world is not unreal. The world is, in a sense, the playfield of Krishna. So here we find a different approach to understanding reality that gives another kind of significance than the absolute freedom given to extra cosmic philosophies like Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. Chaudhuri also talks about another form of spiritual philosophy, which is Tantra. And we can see in Tantra what happens is that the entire world is seen to be a formulation of the energies of Shakti. In other words, there's a consciousness. Total being is a dynamic consciousness. The whole has got this dynamic consciousness that formulates itself into entities that seem to be separate. So if we think about the life of Sri Aurobindo and the three major experiences that he had in his early life, we find that they map to these kinds of experiences. The transcendental experience that he had with Nirvana, the experience of a active Brahman, the forces and powers of that transcendental being formulating all the entities of the world as a kind of Shakti, which is the tantric realization, and the immanence of the transcendental in each entity, which is the notion of relationality in the schools that are schools of Krishna worship, Vaishnavism. Now, Chaudhuri points out that the Bhagavad Gita attempts a synthesis of all these. And we saw earlier how the Bhagavad Gita is central to Sri Aurobindo's understanding, and also a lot of his integral yoga is derived from it. And when Chaudhuri is talking about integral yoga as a power of creative living, he's talking about Brahma Karma Samadhi of the Gita. In other words, if our action is proceeding out of a contact or union with transcendental sources, we have freedom, and that freedom translates to creative activity. We can see that when we are creative in our lives, we seem to contact a greater universality. We are operating out of a greater impersonal universality that is using our instruments. So in a inversion of that, we may say that if we live in an existence which is more universal, more free, then we can mobilize that kind of consciousness into a more powerful creative action. And that ultimately gives us this relationship between transcendence and action. But there are many other things to the Bhagavad Gita as well. and to integral existence, integral life, including the union of the three different yogas. The yoga of knowledge, which relates to integral the Advaita Vedanta, the yoga of works that relates to Tantra in a way, because it's the energies that drive the world and a kind of union with the divine will. And ultimately, we have the schools of love, the yoga of love, which is at the center of the Bhagavad Gita, because it is through that that we transform ourselves and have ultimate significance in a divine life on earth. So Chaudhuri, from here, this consideration is the Indian part of the consideration. It is what he calls integral Vedanta, but he is going to universalize this and make it integral non-dualism. And for that, he's going to look at world philosophies, particularly Western philosophies, and see how they match up or how they can be integrated in terms of the integral yoga. He starts with monotheism, for example. Monotheism is a belief in a single creator God. So in that, there is a single God that may have a set of divine qualities, maybe infinite qualities, or maybe special qualities, but it is related to the world as in terms of a creator-creation relationship. This is like some of the Vaishnav schools, that like the schools of duality, for example, dualism, the Dvaita. So we do have a dualism happening over here, and sometimes to explain the fact that this God is perfect but the world is imperfect, we introduce another dualism, which is the dualism of good and evil. And Chaudhuri is going to say that that is a kind of a putting on of determinisms to something which is free and undetermined, and can create fanaticism. But also we have to see that it's possible to see this in itself as complementary with freedom. So we find that in the Veda, again in the Bhagavad Gita, the notion of good and evil is introduced. But good and evil are not absolute. Absolute is a transcendental non-duality, and good and evil are relative, but they are necessary and significant to the world because they are the energies or polarities that cause evolution. It is through our contact with this, something which we cannot avoid, unavoidable struggle between forces that seem to impede the movement of consciousness and that seem to encourage growth of consciousness, that we evolve. We evolve through the struggle in our own lives. And that would give a significance to these forms of duality. But they're forms of duality that are not absolute. So that's their place, as it were, when we are talking about a complementary relationship of different ideologies. Then he talks about monism, and by monism he means exclusive principles treated as absolutes. Like materialism is a monism. What it's going to say is that matter is the one property or principle, it's the one principle that can describe all of reality. Everything else is a function or epiphenomenon of matter. That's a materialist monism. Similarly, he's talking about a rational idealism as a monism, and various kinds of monisms like that. So these are various forms of monism. Again, treated exclusively, they are problematic, but if we include them as forms of universality that coexist with others, then we find that they are complementary with these others. He moves on to pantheism, and he considers Spinoza as a pantheist, in where he's saying that there is the notion of a cosmic absolute. So this idea of a cosmic absolute where everything is a part of the one is a certain kind of a emergence out of these relative monist descriptions, relative monisms, as it were. So this is a pantheism where the whole is the whole cosmos, and everything is a expression of that cosmos. Now here, of course, again treated exclusively, we've lost the transcendent possibilities, and also the independence of individuals. They are dependent on the cosmic in this case, rather, instead of having transcendent quality of freedom of will, we have determined wills. Then he takes up the notion of panentheism, which is a term coined by a philosopher, Krauss. And this is, in some sense, the work of Sri Aurobindo, the work of Whitehead, the work of Gilles Deleuze. All these people may be called panentheists of a certain kind, because here there is ideology that believes in a transcendence and an immanence. And so we find that just as in our Upanishadic hymn to the whole, there is something that is transcendent, and when something emerges from it, it becomes immanent in that. And yet the transcendent is not lost. It continues to have inexhaustible emergences possible from it. And in each emergence, it is immanent in its fullness in that, and also capable of producing other forms from there. So this kind of a infinite potency of self-multiplication exists in the notion of panentheism, one way of thinking about it. Then he talks about absolutism, which is a logically indefinable system of all experiences. And he introduces this in terms of Bradley's philosophy. So in integral non-dualism, all these find their place because they are all complementary. There is a relative truth to them. There is a significance to them. But none of them are exclusive, and ultimately all of them coexist in a convergent integrality, according to which we find that they have both an absolute and a relative value. Now, what Chaudhuri is going to do, however, is he privileges the transcendental. And he does that from the same kind of linear principle where he's saying that the non-determinate has to be the ultimate. But Sri Aurobindo has an interesting line in one of his aphorisms where he says, God cannot be bound by his freedom. And this is a very interesting sentence, because what we are being told is that every determinate binding of the divine reduces the divine. But why should it reduce the divine if the divine can be free with that determinate binding? So any particular form, any ideology, if we don't take it to be exclusive, if we don't take it to be something that binds the divine, but is an appearance of the divine, it can be equally proper as a description, face, form of the integral one. Then Chaudhuri then has 2 chapters on existentialism. And these are interesting chapters because we are now coming to modern philosophy, and we can see that as far as Chaudhuri is concerned, he's seeing this move or turn in modern philosophy as something that may open up a comparison or a consonance with integral yoga. The first of these chapters considers the duality or the kind of contradiction between existentialism and rationalism. And in fact, the appearance of existentialism as a philosophy could be said to have its origin in a reaction to rationalism. So what is rationalism? Rationalism is a ideology of the world being reasonable. Everything has reason to it. We can understand the world in terms of its reasons. And this understanding of the world in terms of reason or rationalizing of the world has different degrees and forms. So Chaudhuri, for example, will start by talking about Descartes. And he'll talk about that as a rational reduction of the world. But in fact, Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am, did not mean by think, I reason, therefore I am. Thinking to Descartes is any mental state. In other words, he's saying any mental state is giving evidence of one's existence. This is not necessarily rationalism, but it's problematic in the same way because, as Chaudhuri points out, what it does is create this trenchant divide between mind and body. We've just discussed this. Mind and body become differences in kind, but the fact that they may overlap, the fact that they may communicate, the fact that they may be immanent in each other. There may be a body in the mind, and there may be a mind in the body. They're of different kinds, but they can communicate as a result. Or the state of parallelism that Spinoza introduces to the relation of mind and body. In other words, there is one experience that's being had by substance that is being experienced mentally by mind and physically by body. These possibilities are subordinated to a privileging of the mind over the body. Now, another way in which rationalism works as an ideology, according to Chaudhuri, can be found in Hegel. And in Hegel, we find that reality is a dialectical progression of ideas. In other words, everything that is happening in history is following the track of certain reasons, ideas that are manifesting through history in the world. And so reality is reduced in a sense to a playing out of rational ideas. Some people confuse this with Sri Aurobindo because they're saying that in Sri Aurobindo's case also we find that there is a evolution taking place and there are some principles that are evolving and the principles are moving towards an integration like a dialectical synthesis, etc. But we should not forget that in Sri Aurobindo's case, we find a participatory and immanent presence of idea forces. Therefore, these ideas are not the primary determiners of reality. Our world is not a world that is being determined by a superior reason, but a world that is unfolding through the play of forces and ideas in the world in which we participate. Another kind of understanding of rationalism that Chaudhuri doesn't touch on, but that is actually very important from the viewpoint of the founding of existentialism, is rationalism as the regime of science and technology. This is how we experience our world today. Everything, as I said, everything's man-made classifications. We find that things are classified in kind of, in ways that are exclusive, and that these exclusive ways of classification are then imposed to make a world. And this imposition is kept in place by technologies. So both through science and technology, we find rationalism as a conditioning and determining factor for our world. So when existentialism appears, it says that we have to first take our existence as the foundation of our understanding. And in this sense, existentialism is closely related to phenomenology and Husserl's analysis of our existence, our phenomenology. And here we find that if we can take our existence as the experience that we are having and our adaptive response to these experiences, if we analyze that, we'll find how much of it is conditioning. We are really constructed. Our constructed responses are what we call our freedom. But if we analyze these, then these will collapse, and from the freedom from conditioning will give us access to a certain type of authenticity of existence. We are capable of making a world when we know that we are conscious of the conditioning factors, that the idea forces of the world are impinging on us. So from that standpoint, we can have a new relationship to time and to non-being or death. Our authenticity lies in our being able to keep our focus on the fact that we are responding to the world as a world that is constantly impinging on us, trying to bring non-being or death to us. And at the same time, that has a horizon, a time horizon, related to how we respond to it. We respond to everything in terms of a time horizon. This leads to our responses. The more free we are, just as we were talking about creative living, the more creative we are. Our individuation is something which is carried out by a will that emerges in us. This is our becoming in the world and the emergence of new properties. So new properties of response, not properties that are given, that are conditioned, include ways in which we are not yet defined. This leads to the notion of a self-exceeding. We are constantly, as it were, trying to gather the resources that we have to overcome the limitations that we are faced with. So this is a life which is emerging from our response to existence that is always taking risks because it denies all the conditioning of the past, the habits which give us a sense of comfort and of, a sense of predictability in the world. If we don't have those, we are risking our existence at every moment. And we also have to find sources of responsibility in ourselves, which are no longer given. What are these sources of responsibility? And there are a variety of answers depending on who we are looking at as the existentialist thinker, that, there are a number of thinkers. Existentialism begins with people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Kierkegaard is similarly talking about the conditioning of the church and how an individual can develop a authentic, unique, and personal relationship with the divine, with God, with Christ, or with whoever, original transcendental source of the universe. And that source is calling us, and that we can listen, heed that call. And that heeding of that call implies not a listening to the various given voices around us, but something deep inside us that responds to that call, recognizes that call and responds to it. That is what Kierkegaard sees as the definition of faith. And it's a leap of faith that takes place once one knows how to make oneself available to the call of the transcendent. Nietzsche, similarly, is seen as one of the founding fathers of existentialism. This term is not used by either Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, but they are seen in retrospect as people who are inaugurating the age of existentialism. Nietzsche is similarly critiquing our conditioning in terms of the ways by which morals are constructed through history, genealogies. So these genealogies of the moral. And if we become conscious of that, we are no longer captured by that. We go beyond good and evil. And our responses to the world in that case depend on a will that we must connect to some kind of authentic source that is greater than the human. That in a sense is nature itself, which is a will to power. And by will to power is meant not a will to power over others, but a will to power over one's own limitations. A will to power in nature is constantly trying to respond to the conditions of the cosmos by creating individuations that can persist, that can survive. And in that sense, there is a overcoming of one's limitations, leading to, in Nietzsche's case, the philosophy of the Superman. Here, in a way, one sees a resonance with Sri Aurobindo coming out of existentialism that is similar in the way Haridas Chaudhuri is parsing the need to become available outside of constructions to the deepest sources of response to the universe inside us. Normally, existentialism is most identified with Jean-Paul Sartre. He uses the term existentialism. Somebody uses it for him. I think it's Marcel uses it for Heidegger, for Sartre. Sartre refuses it at first, but later accepts this term. But Sartre, in his major work, Being and Nothingness, is similarly talking about awakening to authenticity as a mood, that sometimes we suddenly realize that all that we are doing, however exalted it is, however in other people's eyes it is a great life, without any notice, can visit us with experiences of nausea, experiences of unrelieved boredom. And these experiences are signs that tell us that this world that is given to us, this construction that we are living, is no longer sufficing. It will collapse. So once it collapses, there's the question, what am I going to do now? What kind of freedom am I left with? Now, as I said, in the case of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and another great philosopher that Sartre is drawing from, that's Heidegger, authentic existence puts us into contact with deeper sources that are the will in the cosmos, some kind of divine will, some kind of transcendental call, or in the case of Heidegger, who talks about poiesis as an emergence out of being, a gathering, he uses this term gathering, by which we reach down to the various constituents, the forces of the world, actually of the earth, and in relation to that, we emerge in response, bringing something new to the world. But in the case of Sartre, he talks about an emptiness. So once the construction collapses, there is nothing. That's why his major work is called Being and Nothingness. And we have to find our own mental resources to develop meaning in the world. We have to develop commitment in action and things like that. Sri Aurobindo would not agree with this, nor would Haridas. I think, as we can see, the view of Nietzsche or of Heidegger are much closer to Sri Aurobindo's understanding of integral yoga. In integral yoga, also an existentialist attitude that looks at reality as something one has to be free from with regard to its conditioning factors is a must. But once that is done, this question of what should I act from is something that is related to finding true sources of the divine within us. And one of the things that Sri Aurobindo is talking about is developing faith as a relation to the whole. So we see him from the very beginning, from his anti-colonial days, going towards yoga because he wanted to find how he could connect with a divine will, how he could know what is to be done, what is it that I'm being asked to do as an act of freedom for myself and for the world, to bring freedom to the world. So this kind of an attitude builds a relationship with something that is known to be present. I mean, to think that is there a divine will? Is the whole, the Purnam, the integral, is it a reality that can respond to me? Is it a reality that I can call, not only listen to its call, but call? And in listening to its, and in calling it, have a faith that it will lead me. So this is something that develops within us. When we are talking about faith, we are talking about a kind of inner certainty that arises after the collapse of the given, in which we feel that we are in relation with the whole. This relation with the whole, even a hint of that, awakens a kind of certitude, a type of knowledge, which faith is not a very good word to translate. The word in Sanskrit that Sri Aurobindo uses for this is Shraddha. Shraddha is a term in yoga, and it literally means a kind of clairvoyant will, a will that has a memory and a knowledge that there is a connection with the whole, and I can call on that connection, and that connection can lead me. So that becomes a existential approach to the integral yoga. It becomes the very ground of the integral yoga, a relationship with the whole that arises in one's depths after one can make oneself available to just that in a bare way, and the rest of the constructed nature of the world can fall apart. Thank you.